Right now, the countries that signed on to the Copenhagen Accord are less than 1 week away from their self-imposed soft deadline. That is a deadline of January 31st to volunteer their emissions reduction targets and share them with one another. That accord, of course, has been criticized as a failure and also lauded as a breakthrough. And 3 top climate negotiators agreed today at a Capitol Hill forum. The accord actually has elements of both. But they also agree the UN needs to reconsider exactly what consensus means if the world is ever to get a strong climate treaty. Executive Editor Margaret Ryan is with us right now after hearing from these negotiators, including Jonathan Pershing, the deputy U.S. climate negotiator.
That's right, Tyler. There were 3 people there, one from Mexico, one from the EU, the current EU chief negotiator, and Jonathan Pershing. Now, Mexico's Luis Alfonso de Alba said it's nearly impossible to get 192 countries to agree on every aspect of any treaty. While communications could be improved, he said it's important not to let the entire UN climate conference be vetoed by a few. Now, that situation essentially forced the Copenhagen Conference to merely note the Copenhagen Accord when a few countries objected to the process, even though it had been worked out by world leaders. Now, Teresa Ribera Rodriguez, who's Spain's climate change chief and currently the lead European Union negotiator, agreed. She said the negotiation by the heads of government gave the accord the highest level of political support ever for any UN treaty. And Jonathan Pershing, as you noted, the deputy U.S. negotiator, said it was remarkable, his word, that not that anyone disagreed, but that so many countries did agree.
For the first time, we recognize that the solutions to climate change will not be held in the hands of a very few countries. It is not possible to get there until the majority of countries begin to take action. Particularly, we begin to cross the divide, a somewhat artificial divide, which divides countries against a 1990 metric of were you or were you not in the OECD at that time. That's not a relevant divide for the world of the 2010s and 2020s. We have to think more creatively about how we carry things forward. And in that sense, this agreement marked a new dimension in that thinking. It marked a dimension in which the language of respective capabilities and responsibilities are both reflected. The notion that if you can act, you ought to act.
But all 3 experts said, while the Copenhagen Accord is progress, it's not enough.
There must be a next stage. 12 paragraphs do not make for an adequate and comprehensive agreement. Even 12 paragraphs that are marked by a subsequent signing, a subsequent association by multiple countries of their intent to carry forward, there is more work to be done, more specificity to be provided, more global agreement to be reached, and it seems clear that we could reach it if we were able to move through building on some of these elements of this political agreement.
Now, the 3 agreed in front of this U.S.-German Marshall Fund forum that more negotiating sessions will be needed ahead of the Mexico City meeting at year's end, more than the 1 meeting now planned. You'll recall China, India, Brazil, and South Africa meeting over the weekend called for at least 5 sessions. Now, De Alba said Mexico's president, Felipe Calderon, is committed to work personally with other nations all this year to ensure a positive outcome in Mexico City. But he warned it probably won't be the single treaty that the U.S. and Europe would prefer. Developing nations aren't ready to accept a legally binding treaty that doesn't include extending the Kyoto Protocol.
Well, let's talk about the Kyoto Protocol, Margaret. This faced a rough road in Copenhagen, certainly not as easy as at least some anticipated on the inside. But even without the U.S. on board, this protocol isn't disappearing.
Well, no, in fact, it turned out to be a third rail in Copenhagen, Tyler. I mean, the original idea was that somehow the Kyoto Protocol and other countries in a long-term cooperative agreement would come together and merge into a single document. And that proved to be a gigantic abyss between some of the developed countries, the U.S. and the rest of the world. The idea that the developed world owes developing countries just pots of money to compensate for historic carbon emissions that are now causing climate damage, that's one a lot of countries are just not willing to give up. And, you know, even though the U.S., with the U.S. not joining, the EU preferring a single document, you know, it kind of remains to be seen whether the current developed countries, Annex 1 country members of the Kyoto Protocol, will kind of just let it wither and move their commitments to another document post-2013, or if they'll feel obliged to indeed extend it to a second commitment period.
No, I was in the room with Jonathan Pershing about 2 weeks ago, Margaret, when he was talking at CSIS about these issues, and he said that fast-track funding was such a key. He said that everything was virtually dead in the water in Copenhagen until his boss, Hillary Clinton, arrived and announced the funding commitment for the U.S. What's going on there? Any more details from him today?
Well, actually, I asked the panel today what's happening with fast-track funding, because you had two things going on there when Secretary of State Clinton arrived. There's fast-track funding, which is $10 billion a year from all the developed world, $10 billion a year for the next 3 years, a total of just about $30 billion. And then there's the effort that these countries all promised to get together so that by 2020 they have raised that number to $100 billion a year in aid. And that, of course, was a very key number in moving the negotiations along. It was the first time the U.S. had made an open commitment like that. But at the New Delhi meeting yesterday, the basic countries said, we want to see some of that money. We expect to see that fast-track money coming out, you know, real soon. And Pershing said the U.S. is currently involved. They've started looking at what they have budgeted, you know, in the State Department and other aid budgets, figuring out what money can go to what projects through what institutions. Ribera also said that, you know, the EU is doing something similar. They're all depending on current institutions like the World Bank and their foreign aid programs to get this money out. But what they're looking at is who they're going to give this kind of money to, and, you know, for what projects, you know, who are the neediest and the places where this money can do the most. They also mentioned that the UN Secretary General has convened what's being called a high-level panel to get discussions underway on how the developed and the wealthier countries are going to approach getting that $100 billion by 2020.
As we said, the self-imposed January 31st soft deadline is now less than a week away. Margaret Ryan, thank you very much.